How does a stranger pay for a whole birthday table like that?
I saw a parent struggling. I didn't want the kid embarrassed.
Let me see your ID.
All right. I'm going to say this once. I'm a federal agent. Now tell me the legal reason you're demanding my ID.
He had barely stepped away from the register when the uniformed officer moved in close, body cam facing him, voice calm but sharp. The officer pointed back toward the counter and kept talking like this was routine. He asked how a stranger could pay for a whole birthday table. He asked what kind of job covered something like that. Then his tone shifted into implication, like the money wasn't just generous, it was suspicious. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't step back either. He kept his hands visible, shoulders relaxed, and answered like someone who understood exactly what this was. The officer wasn't satisfied. He kept pressing. He asked again what he did for work. He asked where the money came from. He kept circling the same idea without saying it straight, that the payment didn't make sense coming from him. Then the officer asked for ID. No clear reason, no complaint from the restaurant, no report of a crime. Just a demand in the middle of a quiet restaurant with families watching from their tables and staff pretending not to listen. And right there in front of a child's birthday party he just helped save, this turned into a power move. Quick pause. Tell me where you're watching from. What state or country are you in right now? And if you watch stories about people staying calm under pressure and still forcing accountability, hit like and subscribe, because this one ends with a body cam doing the exact job it was supposed to do. Now, rewind for a second, because this didn't start as some big scene. It started as a normal night and one small decision. The restaurant was one of those family places that did kids' parties all the time. Bright menu boards, a few booths, a bigger section in the back where groups could take over tables. That night, there was a birthday party getting set up. Balloons, kids running around, parents trying to keep it organized. At the register, one of the parents, Tanya Brooks, was struggling. It wasn't dramatic like a movie. It was the quiet kind of struggle. Checking her phone, looking at the receipt, going back and forth with the cashier, trying to make it work without everybody noticing. The manager, Maribel Santos, was doing that professional smile people do when they're trying to help, but also trying to keep the line moving. The staff had a rhythm going, but you could see the tension building. A big group bill holds everything up. Everyone feels it. That's when Darius Cole noticed. Darius wasn't part of the party. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there to pick up food and get out. He had the look of someone who moved through places without needing attention. Clean clothes, nothing flashy, calm face, scanning the room the way trained people do without being obvious. He heard just enough to understand what was happening. The bill was too high. The parent was short. And the moment was about to turn embarrassing in front of a room full of kids. So he made a decision. Quick and simple. He stepped up and covered the table. No speech, no announcement. Just a card on the counter and a quiet nod that he'd take care of it. The cashier processed it. The manager's shoulders dropped. Tanya looked stunned and relieved at the same time. The restaurant kept moving again. The party could continue without that heavy moment hanging over it. That should have been the end of it. But right after the payment cleared, a uniformed officer who had been sitting in a corner booth, either eating, waiting on an order, or just posted nearby, turned his head and locked onto Darius, like the payment had set off an alarm. This is where the power chess started. The officer didn't walk up like someone coming to say thanks. He walked up like someone coming to check a story. He positioned himself close enough that Darius couldn't ignore him, but not so close it looked aggressive on camera. He angled his body so the body cam would catch Darius's face clearly, and then he began the questioning. And he framed it like curiosity at first. The kind of friendly questions that aren't really friendly. The kind that force you to defend normal behavior. Darius answered calmly. He explained what happened. He said he saw the parents struggling and didn't want the kid's birthday ruined over money. The officer didn't accept that explanation like a normal person would. He treated it like a cover story. He asked what Darius did for work. Darius gave a general answer. Nothing specific, nothing dramatic, just enough to be polite. The officer pushed harder. He repeated the work question like the first answer didn't count. Then he moved to money. He emphasized the amount. He acted like paying for a group table was automatically suspicious. This is the part people who haven't lived it don't understand. Because none of these questions are technically shouted. None of it sounds crazy if you isolate one sentence. But the message is clear when you put it together. The officer had decided Darius didn't match his idea of someone who pays for a big table, so now Darius had to prove he belonged in his own life. And the restaurant felt it. The manager slowed down behind the counter. A couple at a nearby table stopped talking mid-sentence. A parent from the party looked over and then looked away fast, like they didn't want to be involved. The kids kept moving because kids don't understand tension the same way, but the adults did. Darius stayed steady. He didn't take the bait. He didn't get loud. He didn't start explaining his entire life to satisfy a stranger with a badge. Instead, he did something that kept the power balance from sliding completely away. He asked what the reason was for the ID request. The officer didn't give a clean answer. He kept it vague, like vague is allowed to do more work than facts. He suggested it was just standard. He suggested it would be easier if Darius just complied. And then he asked for ID again. That's where part one ends, because the next moment is the moment everything changes. Not because Darius got emotional, but because he stayed controlled and made the officer's body cam capture the exact behavior that had already become a pattern. The officer repeated the ID request like it was the simplest thing in the world, like Darius was the one making it complicated. Darius didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He kept it practical. He asked again what he was being detained for, or what law he was suspected of breaking. He asked it calmly, the way people ask, when they know the answer matters later. The officer didn't give a clear reason. He kept it in that gray area where authority tries to live when it doesn't have facts. He acted like paying for a table was enough to justify questions. He acted like Darius should be grateful the officer was checking. This is where the power game gets obvious. If Darius refused, the officer could escalate and call it non-compliance. If Darius complied, the officer got to treat him like a suspect without ever naming a crime. Either way, the officer controlled the frame. But Darius didn't panic and he didn't perform. He did what trained people do. He slowed everything down. He told the officer that he wasn't trying to make a scene. He said he'd already explained what happened. He said he was willing to cooperate, but he wanted the reason for the ID request to be clear. The officer didn't like that. You could tell because he shifted from curious to firm. He kept his voice level, but he tightened the language. He leaned slightly closer, making sure the body cam stayed locked on Darius's face. A couple of customers were watching openly now. The manager behind the counter had stopped pretending. Tanya, the parent Darius had helped, stood near the pardony area with a look that mixed gratitude and dread, like she knew she was watching her good moment get turned into something ugly. Darius made a choice. He reached slowly, gave the officer what he asked for, and did it in a way that removed any excuse for escalation. No sudden movements, no attitude, just a controlled handoff. The officer looked at the ID like he expected to find one story and instead found another. The shift was immediate. His posture changed first. The "I'm in charge" stance softened. His eyes moved faster, like he was rereading the same line to make sure it said what it said. The energy that had been pushing Darius suddenly pulled back. Then his tone changed. It wasn't just polite. It was careful. Because the ID didn't belong to a random guy who made a generous purchase. It belonged to someone the officer now had to treat as a professional peer, an off-duty federal agent. And what happened next is the part that tells you everything. The officer didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge how aggressive the questioning had been. He didn't address the implication that the money might be illegal. He didn't say anything to the parent whose party had been dragged into it. He didn't reset the room. He just pivoted. He said a few clipped, face-saving words. Stuff that sounded like it was meant for the camera more than for Darius. Then he handed the ID back, stepped away, and walked out like the whole thing was finished. No accountability in the moment, just retreat. Darius didn't chase him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to embarrass him in front of the room. He stayed consistent because Darius understood something a lot of people learn too late. The moment isn't where you win. The paperwork is where you win. The review is where you win. The footage is where you win. He put the ID away, turned back toward the counter, and checked on Tanya and the manager with a quick, calm glance, like he was making sure they were okay without turning it into a bigger scene. The party tried to continue, but the mood had changed. Adults were quieter. People were acting normal in that way. People act when they're trying to convince themselves they didn't just watch something messed up. Darius left with his food, and on the outside, it probably looked like nothing happened. But Darius didn't treat it like nothing. Because what the officer did wasn't just questions. It was a public stop without a stop. An accusation without an accusation. A demand without a reason. And the only thing that stopped it was the officer realizing who he was talking to. That difference mattered. Not because federal agent status makes someone more human, but because the officer proved he knew how to act right the whole time. He just didn't think he had to. That night, Darius documented everything while it was fresh. Not emotional, just precise. Time, location, description, what was said, how it escalated, how it ended. He noted the body cam. He noted the restaurant had witnesses. And then he did the most important part. He reported it through proper channels the correct way, the way that forces a record. Because Darius knew this wasn't just about him. If the officer was comfortable doing that in a restaurant over a birthday bill, he'd done it before. Darius didn't post about it. He didn't try to turn it into a public showdown. He did the opposite of what people expect in these situations. He treated it like a report. The next morning, he went through the proper channels, the boring channels that actually matter. He wrote a clear account of what happened. Location, time, the reason he was there, the reason he paid, and the exact way the officer approached him. He emphasized the key issue. The officer demanded ID and implied criminal activity without any stated basis. He also noted something that made it impossible to brush off. The officer was recording the whole thing on Bodycam, and the restaurant had witnesses. That combination forces movement. Complaints get ignored when they're vague. They don't get ignored when the department can pull video and compare it to policy. The report landed with a supervisor inside the local department, Lieutenant Hannah Price, who had seen enough complaints over the years to know what usually happens. Most of the time, there's no footage. The officer writes a short statement, and it becomes a misunderstanding. This time, there was a camera. Price requested the body cam from that shift, not just the clip, the full segment surrounding it. That matters because short clips can be framed as context missing. Full segments show patterns, approach, tone, escalation, and whether the officer had a legal reason or just a feeling. When she watched it, the issue was obvious. The officer didn't respond to a call. He wasn't dispatched. There was no complaint about Darius. The trigger was the payment itself, and the officer's suspicion came from the payment not matching who he thought Darius was. The questioning wasn't a quick check. It was a layered interrogation disguised as conversation. Work, money, legality, then ID. And when the federal credentials appeared, the officer's tone changed instantly. That's the part supervisors can't ignore, because it proves the officer understood the boundary the whole time. He just chose not to respect it until he thought he needed to. Price did what good supervisors do when they know one clip might be part of something bigger. She expanded the review. She requested additional body cam footage from the same officer, random segments, routine stops, casual interactions. Not because she wanted to get him, but because one incident can be argued away. A pattern can't. And that's where things got worse. The department's internal review team found more moments that felt familiar. The officer approaching people over minor non-issues, asking personal questions that didn't match the situation, pushing for ID when he didn't clearly articulate a reason. The behaviors weren't always identical, but they had the same structure. Pick a target, create suspicion, ask questions until the person looks nervous. Treat nervousness as confirmation. Escalate to ID. And when the person pushed back calmly, the officer's tone would harden. When the person had status, the officer would soften. That's how patterns look in real life. Not dramatic, repetitive, predictable. At that point, the department couldn't keep it as a quiet internal matter. Policy required escalation, and frankly, self-preservation did too. Price contacted the unit that handled professional standards investigations. An external oversight unit was notified as well, because once you have allegations tied to body cam evidence and potential bias-related policing, outside review becomes the safest path for the agency. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. That move always triggers reactions inside a department. Some people say it's premature. Some say it's overdue. Some start warning each other to be careful on camera, like the camera is the problem instead of the behavior. But oversight doesn't care about hallway talk. Oversight cares about footage, policies, and outcomes. Investigators began mapping the timeline. They pulled the restaurant encounter. They pulled the other segments. They documented the lack of clear cause for ID demands in multiple interactions. They compare them to department rules about consensual encounters, detentions, and documentation requirements. And here's the thing. Darius's report wasn't treated as special just because he was federal. If anything, the report forced the department to do what it should have done for anyone. Because the video made the real question unavoidable. How many people were treated like suspects for doing normal things without the right ID to end it? Then the story escaped the building. Someone requested records. Someone talked. Someone leaked. And it happens in almost every case like this, especially when there's body cam. The restaurant clip made its way online. Not in some edited, sensational way. Just enough to show the main facts. A black man pays for a birthday party, gets treated like the payment is suspicious, gets pressed for work details, gets implied as criminal, gets asked for ID with no clear reason, then the whole tone changes when the ID reveals he's federal. And now the department wasn't just dealing with a complaint, they were dealing with public trust collapsing in real time. Once the restaurant body cam clip hit social media, the department lost control of the narrative fast. People weren't debating tone anymore. They were watching a uniformed officer turn a kind gesture into suspicion, press for work and money details, then demand ID with no stated reason, until the ID showed federal credentials and the whole attitude changed. Within days, the department made it official. The officer stayed on administrative leave while the investigation expanded, and an external oversight unit was brought in to review the footage and the department's handling. The restaurant staff and a few customers were contacted for statements, but the video was already doing most of the talking. Then the internal review locked in what Darius's report hinted at. Supervisors didn't just treat it as one bad interaction. They pulled more body cam from the same officer. That's where the pattern came out. Repeated consensual contacts that weren't really consensual. Repeated phishing questions. Repeated ID requests without clear cause. And a consistent difference in how he acted once someone had status or connections. The findings were straightforward. The officer violated policy on professional conduct, improper use of authority, and failing to articulate lawful reasons for escalating an encounter. And the body cam made it worse for him, not better, because it showed the exact progression and the exact pivot once he realized who Darius was. After the oversight review and the command staff meetings, the department terminated him. The public reason was policy violations and loss of public trust. But the real reason was simple. The video showed a behavior pattern, not a one-time mistake, and it became indefensible once the public could watch it for themselves. Darius didn't do interviews first. He did paperwork first. He filed a formal complaint through the correct federal and local channels. Then his attorney sent a notice to preserve evidence, specifically naming the full body cam file, dispatch logs, and any prior complaints tied to that officer. That locked the department into a timeline and stopped the usual missing context excuse before it could start. Once the officer was terminated, the civil case moved fast. The claim was simple. Darius was treated like a suspect for doing something normal, questioned about how he could afford it, implied to be involved with illegal money, and pressured for ID without a clear, lawful reason. The body cam captured the whole thing, including the instant tone change when his credentials were revealed. The city settled for $500,000. No long trial, no drawn-out public fight, just a number that confirmed the department understood the risk of letting a jury watch that footage. But the settlement didn't stop at money. As part of the resolution, the department added mandatory training focused on biased suspicion and improper ID demands, tightened review protocols, so supervisors had to document lawful reasons for escalations, and started routine body cam audits aimed at spotting pattern behavior early instead of waiting for a viral clip. And that was the final twist. The officer's own camera, the one he wore like protection, became the evidence that ended his career and forced the department to change how it policed everyday people. So, here's the question for you. If you were in that restaurant, would you have complied immediately, or would you have calmly asked what you were being stopped for? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you want more real stories, where staying calm, knowing your rights, and letting the record speak leads to accountability.
Open the door, federal agents. We're here on an urgent matter.
Last warning. We don't have time for...
Bro, there's a camera right there. It's staring at us. Keep it together. Don't look at it. Don't.
The doorbell rang and the camera alert hit their phones at the same time. Two men were on the porch in federal-looking gear, standing in a way that felt practiced, like they'd done this before. The lead one kept talking without pausing, like he was trying to fill the space so nobody had time to think. He kept claiming he had a warrant and kept pushing for the door to be opened immediately. Inside, Monica Reed didn't walk up to the door. Caleb Reed noticed the van first, parked for speed, not for official work. Avery Reed noticed the posture, too close, too pushy, too eager to get inside. They didn't argue, they didn't panic. They stayed behind the locked door, used the camera speaker, and asked for the kind of verification real teams expect. That's when the lead man started contradicting himself. He couldn't keep the agency straight. He couldn't keep the reasons straight. He just kept repeating legal-sounding phrases like he'd memorized them. And then his partner opened a duffel and pulled out a battering ram, like it was the next step in the plan. Before we continue, drop where you're watching from, your state or your country. And if you're into stories where people don't get bullied and the camera catches everything, like and subscribe. Now, rewind a few minutes, because this didn't start with yelling. It started with an assumption the imposters were counting on, that a uniform and a hard voice would make someone open a door. It was 7:32 p.m. The Reed house was quiet and normal. Monica was finishing up notes from the day, the kind of paperwork nobody sees on TV. Caleb had just come back from checking the mailbox and the perimeter out of habit, not paranoia. Avery was home for dinner, still in that halfway space between family and work mode, where your brain never fully shuts off. When the chime rang, all three glanced at the same thing without speaking. The live feed, two men. Federal-style tactical look, clean enough to fool most people, but the longer the camera held them in frame, the more the details started failing. Monica clocked the first set of errors fast. The patches looked like a copy of a copy. The placement wasn't quite right. The vest setup looked heavy but not functional, like it was arranged to be seen rather than used. The badge area looked wrong. Not just the shine, but The way it sat and the way the man kept angling his torso so the camera couldn't get a clean look. Caleb watched their hands and feet. They stood too close to the door, close enough that if someone opened it even a few inches, they could force the gap. Their stance wasn't the controlled spacing you saw with real teams. It was crowding. It was pressure. Avery watched the van and the street. No marked units, no visible coordination, no one on the sidewalk, no one holding a perimeter. If this was real service of anything serious, there would be structure. There would be more than two guys in costumes standing on a porch, acting like time was running out. So the Reeds did what professionals did at home, the same way they did on duty. They didn't explain. They didn't debate. They controlled the variables they could control. The door stayed locked. Monica kept her voice steady through the camera speaker and asked for verification, agency identification, a supervisor contact, and a way to view the warrant in a readable form. The lead man responded by insisting he had the authority, claiming the paperwork existed and pushing for immediate entry. He tried to keep the conversation one-directional. He tried to make it feel like the only choices were compliance or consequences. But Monica didn't accept that frame. She asked for basic details that any real operation could provide without compromising safety, which court issued it, what the case number was, and what the reason for urgency was. That's when the story started changing. The man shifted from saying the warrant was ready to saying he didn't have to present it at the door. Then he claimed he would show it once they opened up. Then he pivoted to a new justification entirely, saying they were there because of illegal firearms. That pivot mattered. Not because illegal firearms couldn't be real, but because he presented it like a magic phrase meant to end the conversation. He didn't offer specific facts. He didn't offer a name tied to the warrant. He just tossed the accusation at the door like it was supposed to scare someone into compliance. Caleb picked up on the second man's behavior, while the lead one talked. The partner wasn't watching the entryway like an officer. He was watching the neighborhood like a thief. His gaze kept snapping to the street, to the side yard, to the driveway, and back to the door. His hands touched the bag like he was waiting for a signal. Avery didn't wait for it to get worse. She stepped back from the entryway, kept the camera feed visible, and called official dispatch. She gave a clean report. Two males in federal-looking tactical clothing claiming a warrant, refusing to present verifiable paperwork, demanding entry, possible impersonation, and a suspicious van positioned for a quick exit. She described what they were wearing and what she could see of the vehicle. Then she did the key thing that separates panic from control. She stayed on the line. While dispatch processed it, Monica kept the porch conversation slow and structured. She asked whether they were claiming exigent circumstances, and if so, what the immediate emergency was. The lead man tried to use the phrase like it ended the discussion. He repeated it, kept pushing that they didn't have to show proof, and kept escalating his tone. That escalation was a tell. Real teams don't need to yell to create authority. They rely on procedure, documentation, and coordination. Yelling is what people do when they want you to stop thinking. Monica stayed calm and told them the door would not open without verification. She instructed them to step back from the threshold and wait while she confirmed their identity through proper channels. The lead man didn't like that. He tried a different pressure tactic. He suggested refusal would turn into bigger problems. He implied they could force the issue. He aimed for fear and confusion, the kind that makes people act just to end the moment. Inside the house, the Reeds made quick, quiet adjustments. Caleb positioned himself where he could cover the entryway if the door somehow failed, but he stayed out of sight of the camera. Monica kept her hands free and her voice level. Avery updated dispatch with every change in behavior on the porch. Then the partner opened the duffel. The camera caught it clearly. Not a tool belt adjustment, not paperwork. The man pulled out a compact battering ram and held it like he'd practiced. He angled his body toward the door. At that point, the situation wasn't a questionable warrant claim anymore. It was an attempted forced entry in real time. And the biggest mistake the imposters made was thinking the people inside would react like regular homeowners. Because Monica didn't scream, she didn't open the door to talk it out. She didn't step into the frame. She leaned toward the camera mic and issued a warning designed to do two things: stop the breach and lock the evidence in place. She informed them that the encounter was being recorded with cloud backup. She made it clear the door would not be opened, and she made it clear real units were already on the way. Then she added the part that changed the temperature on the porch. The people inside were armed federal agents, and if these men tried to break in, they were committing a serious felony on video. The lead man's posture shifted. The partner hesitated with the ram in his hands, because the performance only worked as long as they were in control. And in that moment, control started slipping. The two men didn't back away like real agents would when they realized they were being recorded and verified. They did the opposite. The lead man leaned closer to the door, like proximity could replace paperwork. The partner tightened his grip on the ram and shifted his feet into a stance that said he was about to swing. From inside, Monica watched their shoulders and hands on the feed, not their mouths. Caleb tracked the distance between the ram and the doorframe. Avery stayed on the phone, feeding dispatch the most important update. The ram was out and the threat had escalated to an active breach attempt. The lead man tried to push the tempo. He kept talking fast, repeating the same legal-sounding phrases, trying to overload the moment so the people inside would make one mistake: crack the door, step into view, or start arguing. But the reads didn't give him any of that. Monica stayed behind the locked barrier and kept her voice level through the speaker. She told them again to step back and present verifiable documentation. She stated clearly that they were refusing entry and that real verification was in progress. And that's where the imposter messed up again. He contradicted himself in a way the camera captured cleanly. He referenced a warrant like it was already signed, then described the situation like it was a fresh emergency, and then tried to combine both to justify immediate entry without showing anything. That combination doesn't exist in real work. You don't get to claim formal paperwork and also claim you're exempt from procedure because of urgency. Real teams can explain the basis. Scammers just keep stacking words until someone gives up. Avery didn't interrupt. She didn't waste time arguing with the porch. She gave dispatch a vehicle description again because she knew how these crews moved. Make a threat, force a door, get inside fast, then disappear before anyone can arrive. Caleb moved one step deeper into the house, not retreating, repositioning. He checked the angle of the hallway and stayed out of sight. If that door came open, he wanted the advantage without being seen first. Monica kept the conversation on the record. The doorbell system wasn't just a camera. It was an upgraded setup with multiple angles and cloud backup. Every second of this, every contradiction, every threat was being preserved outside the house. The partner with the ram lifted it slightly like a test. Not a strike yet, but enough to show intention. That's when Monica changed her approach. She stopped treating it like a questionable interaction and started treating it like an imminent felony. Her tone stayed calm, but the message got sharper. She warned them that the people inside were federal agents, that the entire encounter was being recorded and uploaded, and that the breach attempt would be documented as impersonation and attempted home invasion. She wasn't trying to sound tough. She was taking away their best weapon: uncertainty. The lead man paused. The partner looked at him. The ram stayed up, but the confidence dropped, because now their risk was obvious. If they breached, they weren't serving a warrant. They were forcing entry into a home with armed, trained occupants, on a recorded feed, with official units already on the way. That's not a gamble criminals like to take, unless they're desperate. For about 2 seconds, it looked like the lead man might try to salvage it with more talking. Then Avery quietly said one word to her parents: dispatch. That was the signal. The official response was close enough that the imposters could feel the clock turning against them. And that's when the mask slipped completely. The lead man stopped trying to explain and started trying to intimidate. He escalated from authority language to threat language, like the goal was to scare the door open before the sirens arrived. The partner shifted his stance and brought the ram higher. He was going to hit. Inside the house, Caleb didn't move toward the door. He didn't give them a silhouette to target. He stayed positioned for the outcome, not the argument. Monica leaned toward the mic one more time and delivered the final warning that mattered. They were on camera. They were identified. And the next action they took would be used in court. Then the sound changed everything. Not a siren yet, not shouting. Just the distant rise of approaching vehicles and the subtle noise of multiple engines slowing down nearby. The lead man heard it first. His head turned toward the street. His eyes shifted off the door. The partner froze mid-motion, ram still raised, because now he was calculating exit routes. The porch camera caught the exact moment both men made the same decision. They weren't going to hit the door. They were going to run. The partner shoved the ram back into the duffel. The lead man stepped back for the first time since arriving. They moved fast, not like officers finishing a call, but like people trying to escape consequences. They cut off the porch, half jogging toward the van, heads turning in quick checks. The lead man fumbled with the keys. The partner yanked the sliding door open and threw the bag inside. And right then, the first marked unit rolled into view at the end of the street. Avery, still on the phone, gave dispatch the live update. The suspects were fleeing to the van, trying to leave now. The van's engine turned over, but the timing was already bad for them. The first responding car came in from one direction. Another unit came from the opposite side, like they'd been guided straight into the best angles. A third vehicle pulled in behind before the van could reverse cleanly. In less than a minute, the van went from getaway to box. The lead man tried to angle the front end out. He couldn't. The partner tried to slide the door shut and sink into the seat like he could disappear. He couldn't. Officers moved in fast and controlled, weapons ready but not reckless, shouting commands that were short and practiced. No screaming, no chaos. Just a clean takedown. Both men were pulled out, separated, and put on the pavement. The porch camera caught most of it from distance. The driveway camera caught the rest, including the moment one officer picked up the duffel and immediately recognized what it was. Because it wasn't just a bag. It was part of a kit. And kits like that don't usually belong to people who are just confused about an address. Within minutes, the responding officers had both men in cuffs. They did the quick safety checks, cleared the van for immediate threats, and then slowed down into investigation mode. Monica, Caleb, and Avery didn't rush outside. They waited until an officer approached their door and identified himself properly through the camera and through dispatch. Only then did Monica open the door, controlled, careful, and with the same rule the whole night had been built on. Verify first. And when the first officer stepped into view and confirmed what they already knew, the tone shifted from danger to reality. This hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been a planned forced entry that failed because the wrong door stayed closed. Once officers boxed the van in and cuffed both men, the scene stopped being two fake agents at a door and became an evidence case. Monica stayed at the threshold and gave the supervisor a clean summary. They claimed a warrant, refused to show it in a readable way, contradicted themselves, escalated to illegal firearms and exigent circumstances, then pulled out a battering ram and tried to force the issue. She also made one thing clear immediately. Everything was recorded with cloud backup from multiple angles. That changed how the response moved. No guessing, no competing stories. The footage locked the timeline and the intent. The van search made it worse for the suspects. Officers found fake credentials, forged-looking paperwork, extra tactical gear, and tools that didn't match any legitimate operation. The biggest red flag was the surveillance material. Notes and printed targets that suggested other houses nearby had been watched and evaluated. That's when it expanded from a local arrest to a wider investigation. Investigators ran the van through cameras, plate readers, and records, then tied it to more planning locations. The suspect's phones and the notes pointed to something even bigger. They weren't freelancing. They had been coached. A name showed up in the notes like a source, not a victim, paired with bullet points on what to say at the door, how to pressure homeowners, and when to escalate. One suspect tried to posture through questioning, but the other started cooperating once he realized the video and the target list removed his exits. That cooperation led to storage gear, more fake IDs, more templates, and eventually a trainer with real law enforcement knowledge who had been teaching them how to sound official without actually understanding procedure. Federal charges hit hard after that. Impersonation, conspiracy, attempted forced entry, and the planning behind it. The camera footage became the centerpiece because it captured the full sequence: the fake authority, the contradictions, the ram, and the attempted breach. In court, misunderstanding didn't survive 10 seconds of that video. The outcome was simple: long sentences, a wider crew identified, and the footage later used for training and community awareness. How to verify identity, demand warrant proof properly, keep the door closed, and call official channels. And here's the question. If someone in official gear showed up at your door demanding entry, would you know how to slow it down and verify it before you opened anything? Drop where you're watching from and what you would do. And if you want more story times like this, where proof beats pressure and accountability follows, hit like and subscribe.
Step back. Hands where I can see them now.
I'm recording. What's your name and badge number? You
You
can't
stop
do that.
arguing and comply.
Don't touch me. I'm not a threat. Why are you coming at me?
Back up now.
I'm on my porch, man.
You can't. Back up. Control 321, start me another unit.
It started as a neighbor argument, and then suddenly there were officers at the door, acting like they were hunting a threat. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. State, city, or country. And if you're here for real stories about rights, body cam footage, and accountability, when police escalate a situation that never needed to escalate, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind. This took place in Park City, Utah. A 15-year-old boy named Jack had been riding a gas-powered bicycle around his neighborhood. Loud engine, neighborhood complaints, the kind of thing that usually ends with someone telling a kid to slow down or take it somewhere else. But it didn't stay normal. A neighbor confronted Jack, and the confrontation turned into a threat. Jack went home and told his father, Michael Franek. Michael's response wasn't to run outside swinging. He moved like a parent, trying to handle a dispute before it spiraled. Figure out what happened, address it, and keep his kids safe. Somewhere in that chain of events, a call went to police. And during that call, someone reported something that changed the entire posture of the response. They claimed Michael had a weapon in his waistband. That's the tiny detail that flipped this from a neighbor dispute into a high-risk arrival. Officers showed up treating the situation like a potential armed encounter. The distance they kept at first, the way they positioned themselves, the way the tone immediately leaned toward commands instead of questions. They weren't arriving to mediate. They were arriving to control. Michael stepped out to meet them. Right away, he tried to establish something basic: who they were, names, badge numbers, badge. The kind of information that creates accountability and prevents later confusion about who did what. But the officers treated that like a challenge. Instead of answering and keeping it calm, they moved the interaction into a compliance test. Their focus wasn't on verifying facts about the neighbor dispute. Their focus was on whether Michael would submit instantly and fully. That's the first power move in situations like this. Convert a conversation into a comply or else moment, even when the underlying call is still unclear. Inside the home, Jack saw the energy and started recording on his phone. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was a teenager watching adults with authority treat his father like a threat based on an unverified claim. Jack's instinct was simple: document everything. That documentation mattered because it limited the room officers had to reshape the story later. As the officers continued, Michael kept asking for identification and basic explanations. He wasn't refusing to cooperate. He was trying to keep the situation grounded. If someone truly believed he was armed, the logical move would have been to confirm that claim carefully, with clear instructions and verification. But instead, the officers stayed stuck in aggressive posture, while the actual facts stayed thin. And that's where the risk grows fast. High-risk energy with low-quality information. Jack kept recording and also asserted boundaries as a witness in his own home. He complained that an officer got close enough to invade his space and physically touched him while ordering him to back up. Jack wasn't the one being accused of anything, but the scene had already shifted into everyone is a problem to manage. Michael tried to keep the contact at the doorway level. No one inside, no one pushing through, no one taking over the home. He stayed focused on procedure, who they were, what they were doing, and why they were escalating without presenting evidence of a real crime. And this is where the chess game gets obvious. If officers entered that call expecting an armed suspect, then backing down would make them look like they overreacted. So the incentive becomes to justify the response by turning normal questions into non-compliance and non-compliance into force. That's what was building. The officers kept pressing. Their language stayed centered on compliance. Michael kept pressing for names, badge numbers, and lawful bases. Jack kept recording and speaking up because he could see the gap between what this started as and how it was being treated. By this point, it wasn't just tense. It was unstable because the next step wasn't going to be more talking. The next step was going to be physical movement toward the home. Officers pushing forward and treating the doorway like permission. And once that happens, the situation stops being a neighbor dispute entirely. It becomes a rights violation question, captured on camera, in a place where the law is supposed to be the clearest. Someone's home. Once the officers started pressing forward, the whole interaction stopped being a doorstep conversation and became a control problem in their minds. Michael stayed focused on keeping it procedural. He kept trying to slow it down and keep the boundary clear. They were at his home, responding to a neighbor dispute, and the weapon claim was still unverified. He wanted names, badge numbers, and a clear reason for what they were about to do. The officers treated his pace as refusal. That's the key switch that drives escalation. When officers decide a person is refusing, they stop listening for facts and start building momentum for force. Jack stayed on his phone and kept recording. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't trying to get in the officers' faces. He stayed close enough to document, but far enough to show he wasn't a threat. Even so, one officer closed space toward Jack and ordered him back. Jack protested that the officer was crowding him and making physical contact while directing him to move. Jack's point was simple. He was a teenager in his own home, recording, and an officer was treating him like part of the problem. Meanwhile, Michael was still outside the threshold, trying to keep the encounter from turning into a push inside the house. The officers didn't pause to verify the waistband claim in a careful way. They didn't do a controlled check and then reset the situation. Instead, they continued the same pattern: give rapid orders, treat questions as resistance, and move closer. Then the tipping point hit. Officers pushed into the home without a warrant. That detail wasn't a technicality. It changed the entire legal and physical reality of the incident. Once officers crossed that line, Michael's attempt to keep the situation calm turned into him trying to keep his home from being taken over. The officers closed on him fast. The moment his body position didn't match their exact instructions, they treated it as a reason to go hands-on. They grabbed him, they took him down. The movement was abrupt and chaotic, not a measured arrest based on a clear crime. It looked like a takedown designed to win control first and explain later. Jack's recording captured the shift. One moment it was argument and procedure, the next it was physical force. Michael ended up on the ground and was tased during the struggle. Officers framed it as necessary because he was not complying, but even as they forced control, their own body cam captured something that mattered. They acknowledged they didn't have solid evidence of an underlying crime driving this level of force. That contradiction is what made this incident explode later. Because if there was no confirmed weapon, no confirmed burglary, and no confirmed violent offense, then what exactly justified rushing into a home, tackling a homeowner, and using a taser? The officers kept pushing the compliance narrative. They treated every movement and every word as something to correct. It wasn't about resolving the neighbor dispute anymore. It was about proving they could dominate the scene. Jack stayed filming through it. He kept asserting that the officers didn't have a warrant and that the situation started as a neighbor dispute, not a violent crime. He didn't magically stop the officers, but he did something important. He kept the record clean. He showed who was escalating and when. And this is where the power chess got ugly. Because once officers use force in a situation that doesn't clearly justify it, the next move is often to protect the decision. That protection usually comes through charges. If the original call doesn't give you a clean charge, you reach for the ones that are easiest to claim after the fact. That's exactly where this headed. After the takedown, officers started talking through potential charges in a way that wasn't tied to the neighbor dispute itself. The focus shifted to behavior-based accusations that can be stacked around any tense encounter: resisting, disorderly conduct, failure to identify. The kind of labels that sound legitimate on paper but often function as cover when the original reason for contact falls apart. Jack kept recording and kept pointing out the problem. He watched officers treat his father as a threat, while also admitting on camera that they didn't have evidence of an actual crime matching the high-risk posture they arrived with. Jack also continued to complain about how officers handled him, including the close physical positioning and contact while ordering him away. Then came the moment that turned this from a troubling incident into a documented scandal. Bodycam footage later captured officers privately discussing how to make charges stick, not discussing evidence, not discussing witness statements, not discussing a clear crime connected to the original call, discussing strategy, discussing how to frame it, discussing how to push pressure points, including juvenile court leverage, as if the goal was to produce consequences that justified what they had already done. And the reason that mattered wasn't just optics, it showed intent. It showed that at least some officers understood the gap between what the call was and how they responded. And instead of correcting course, they moved toward creating a legal story that supported force after the fact. By the time the scene settled, Michael had been forcibly detained. Jack had been treated like an obstacle in his own home. And the entire incident had shifted away from a neighbor dispute into something much bigger, a question of warrantless entry, unnecessary force, and charge stacking talk captured on Bodycam. Once the footage started circulating, the story stopped being a private neighborhood call and became a public example of what happens when a false weapon claim triggers a high-risk response and officers refuse to de-escalate. The first wave of reaction focused on the basics people could see without legal training. This started as a neighbor dispute involving a teenager on a gas-powered bicycle, but officers arrived treating it like an armed threat. Then they pushed into the home without a warrant, used force on the father, and treated the kid filming like a problem. The second wave focused on what made it worse. The officers' own cameras captured them, admitting they didn't have clear evidence of an actual underlying crime tied to Michael in that moment. That meant the public wasn't debating opinions. They were reacting to contradictions. And then the body cam discussion about charges hit. That piece changed the conversation from bad judgment to intentional cover. Because the footage showed officers privately discussing how to make charges stick after the fact, including tossing around common add-on charges like resisting and disorderly conduct, and talking about pressure through juvenile court. They weren't talking about a proven offense that happened before police arrived. They were talking about building a legal justification for the force and entry that had already happened. That's why the legal side didn't just fade away. When the case reached prosecutors, the response was not a full endorsement of what the officers did. Parts of the case were declined or reduced, but it didn't cleanly disappear either. Misdemeanor charges lingered and moved toward a trial schedule, which is its own kind of punishment, even when the case is weak. It means court dates, legal fees, stress, and the constant risk that a system will reward the narrative of compliance over the reality of what happened. For the Franek family, that meant the incident didn't end when the officers left. It stayed in their lives as a legal process they didn't ask for. At the same time, the department had to deal with the fact that the most damaging parts were on their own cameras. An internal investigation eventually found policy violations. That matters because departments don't always admit that on the record unless the documentation is strong. In this case, the record wasn't just a complaint. It was video, including the private discussion about charges. Corrective actions were assigned, and later, 2 officers were fired for failing to complete the required corrective steps. That outcome wasn't framed as a dramatic admission of wrongdoing. It was the kind of accountability that happens through paperwork and policy, slow, quiet, and often narrower than what the public expects. But it still mattered because it confirmed officially that the response did not meet standards. The family didn't treat that as good enough. They filed a civil rights lawsuit seeking damages and an apology. The lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about putting the department under a different kind of pressure, one that requires sworn statements, discovery, depositions, and a real explanation for why officers entered a home without a warrant, and then discussed charge strategies after admitting they lacked evidence of an underlying offense. That's the accountability path people don't see on social media. Viral clips create attention. Lawsuits create consequences. And Jack's role in that mattered more than people realized at first. His recording wasn't just a teenager being defiant. It was the reason the timeline stayed intact. It prevented the incident from being simplified into a report that said, "Subject resisted," and left it there. It gave the public and investigators something solid to compare against the official narrative. By the time this moved toward trial scheduling and civil litigation, the neighbor dispute was almost irrelevant. The real issue was how easily a false claim can turn police into a high-risk entry team, and how quickly some officers will shift into charge stacking mode when the original reason for the call doesn't support the level of force they used. Here's the part viewers should sit with. If the weapon in the waistband claim had never been made, this likely stays a complaint and a conversation. If Jack hadn't recorded, it likely becomes a report about non-compliance. If Bodycam hadn't captured the private charge talk, the department could have framed it as confusion and moved on. That's how ridiculous becomes dangerous. When the system has the power to turn a thin story into a serious encounter, and then write the official ending. So, ask yourself, if you were Michael, would you have tried to slow it down and demand names and badge numbers? Or would you have said as little as possible and tried to end it fast? And if you were Jack, would you have recorded, even with officers trying to push you back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever seen a situation escalate because someone made a claim that officers treated like fact, share that too. And if you want more story times like this, realistic, modern, and focused on accountability, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Stop right there. Don't move.
What is happening?
Why are you out here right now?
I'm running. I live nearby.
What's the reason for the stop? You match a description.
A description of what? I'm in running clothes. Just a person.
Keep your hands where I can see him.
The patrol cars came in fast and tight, like they were closing a net. Tomas Griff was still in running clothes, sweat on his forehead, phone in his hand, and a deputy was already telling him to stay right where he was while another unit rolled up behind him. Tomas kept his posture steady and his hands visible, but the scene around him kept growing. More lights, more doors opening, more deputies looking at him like he had already done something. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, tell people where you're watching from in the comments. State, city, even country. And if you watch stories about real-world accountability, power plays, and people staying calm when the system gets it wrong, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now rewind, because this didn't start with Tomas doing anything illegal. It started with a call. Deltona, Florida. Suburban streets, quiet blocks, the kind of neighborhood where people notice anything unfamiliar and treat it like a problem. Deputies were responding to a reported burglary. A witness had called it in, and dispatch pushed out a description. The problem was the description was the kind that causes trouble. Vague, inconsistent, and easy to force under the first person who matched the broadest parts of it. And Tomas, a black man out for a run, ended up in the path of that match. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running away from anything. He was literally running the way runners do. Steady pace, focused, moving through his route. He had a life that didn't fit the story the deputies were arriving with. He owned property nearby. He knew the area. He was the kind of person who handled details because he had learned the hard way that details were what kept situations from spinning out. That mattered because the deputies didn't arrive looking for clarity. They arrived looking for control. When they spotted Tomas, they didn't approach like he was a runner who might have seen something. They approached like he was the suspect. Tomas noticed it immediately. The spacing of the cars, the way they boxed him off the street, the way they positioned themselves to cut off movement, the way no one started with basic questions meant to confirm identity in a normal, calm way. Tomas stayed calm anyway. He told them who he was. He explained that he was out for a run. He offered identification early, before anyone had to demand it. He tried to do everything people are told to do in these moments. But that is where the power chess game started. Because even when a person cooperates, a stop like this can still become a detention if the officers decide they need a hold while they figure things out. And that's the danger zone. That's where vague descriptions and pressure from higher-ups turn into extra units, longer waits, and more aggressive posture. Tomas handed over ID. He explained he owned property nearby and could prove it. He pointed out he had nothing to hide because he was live streaming the whole thing on his phone. He said it clearly, not as a threat, but as a fact. Everything was being recorded. That detail changed the temperature. Some deputies got more careful right away. Others got more irritated. You could see it in their body language. Recording removes the ability to rewrite what happened later. It makes people choose their words differently. It forces everyone to act like they might have to explain themselves. Even with that, the scene kept tightening. A deputy kept Tomas in place and made it clear he was not free to just continue his run. Another deputy moved around him, scanning him like they were looking for something that wasn't there. Tomas stayed polite, but he also stayed firm. He didn't get loud, he didn't panic, he didn't make sudden moves. He did everything right. And still, the deputies treated him like everything right was suspicious. Tomas asked what the description actually was. The answers he got didn't line up cleanly. One detail would be mentioned, then another would contradict it. The direction of travel didn't make sense with where Tomas was found. Clothing details were shaky. Even the confidence level behind the words sounded thin, like they were leaning on close enough. That's the thing about these situations. Close enough becomes a trap, because the deputies were not just responding to a call. They were responding to expectations. A burglary call creates adrenaline. It creates a need to show action. It creates a feeling that letting the wrong person walk away would be a failure. And when that mindset takes over, every calm explanation from an innocent person starts being treated as a story that needs to be tested. Tomas kept answering. He kept presenting proof. He kept his voice measured, and then one deputy, the one who seemed less aggressive than the others, started acting like he was trying to keep the situation from getting worse. That deputy didn't say Tomas was under arrest, but he also didn't treat him like a free citizen. He gave the vibe of someone stuck in the middle, someone who didn't fully believe Tomas was the suspect, but also didn't want to challenge the chain of command in front of everyone. Tomas could tell. And viewers could tell, too, because the deputy's behavior didn't match the level of force being applied. The deputy kept signaling that Tomas just needed to wait, that it would be sorted out, that nobody wanted anything bad to happen. Tomas didn't take comfort in that because he knew what the situation looked like from the outside. A black man boxed in by multiple patrol cars while deputies checked his story. That's not reassurance. That's risk. At one point, the deputy admitted something important. The pressure wasn't coming from evidence in front of them. It was coming from above. A sergeant was pushing the stop forward. The message was basically to hold Tomas until they could be sure. That's when Tomas did what more people wish they could do in these moments. He didn't explode, but he did name the pattern. He pointed out that the treatment didn't match the facts. He pointed out how quickly they moved from checking to detaining. He pointed out how often fit the description becomes a shortcut that turns black men into default suspects. And he kept it grounded, not emotional. He didn't have to yell. The scene was loud enough. The deputy responded the way people often respond when they don't want to face what's happening. He kept insisting it wasn't about race. He tried to make it sound like procedure, like everyone would get the same treatment. But right there in real time, Tomas was proving the opposite. Because the deputies weren't working from solid information. They were working from a vague description and the assumption that the runner they stopped could be the guy. And once that assumption is in place, everything Tomas did got filtered through it. His calmness became too calm. His proof became too ready. His phone became a problem. Even the fact that he owned property nearby became something they wanted to verify, like it was an unlikely claim instead of a normal fact. That's the chess move the system uses. Make normal things sound suspicious, then act like detention is the responsible choice. While this was happening, the neighborhood was watching. People came out. A woman nearby noticed the setup and started paying attention because the scene didn't match the story of a dangerous burglary suspect. Tomas wasn't acting like someone who had just broken into a home. He was acting like someone who had just been stopped for existing. The deputy's tone shifted again because now it wasn't just Tomas's live stream. It was the public. And that creates another kind of pressure, one the department can't control. Still, nobody was ready to admit the obvious. They didn't actually have enough to justify what they were doing. So they did what departments do in that moment. They stalled. They kept Tomas there. They made calls. They waited for confirmation. They repeated the same phrases, just doing their job, just checking, just making sure. Tomas asked what was taking so long because the longer detention drags out, the more it becomes its own punishment. It interrupts your day, it humiliates you, it marks you in front of strangers, and it sends the message that your freedom depends on whether someone feels like believing you. The deputy kept telling Tomas that it would be fine and that it wasn't going to go anywhere serious. He kept circling back to the same reassurance, but he also kept circling back to the same excuse. They needed to confirm, and the confirmation they needed wasn't coming from facts at the scene. It was coming from somewhere else, someone getting a clearer image from a witness or a video. The longer Tomas stood there, the more the stop stopped being about a burglary and started being about control. The deputies kept him boxed in on the roadside like they were freezing time until someone else could solve their uncertainty for them. Cars stayed positioned to limit movement. One deputy kept a steady watch on Tomas's hands and waist, like he was expecting a sudden change. Another stayed near the patrol car, working the radio, waiting for something, anything, that would justify how big the response had gotten. Tomas didn't give them a single excuse to escalate. He stayed still. He kept his phone up. He kept his voice level. He repeated the same basic facts: who he was, where he lived, why he was there, and that he could prove his connection to the area. He didn't argue about authority. He argued about logic. And that's when the power chess really showed itself. Because once an officer decides someone is a possible suspect, the goal quietly shifts. It's no longer figure out what happened. It becomes don't look wrong. So the deputies leaned into stalling tactics. They didn't accuse Tomas directly, but they also didn't treat him like a regular person who had been temporarily questioned. They held him in that gray zone where the citizen has all the limits of detention without the clarity of an arrest. Tomas kept asking for the description details, and the more it came out, the messier it sounded. It wasn't a clean match. It wasn't even close. The suspect description kept wobbling. Clothing details that didn't match a runner. Physical details that changed depending on who was speaking. And direction of travel that didn't line up with where Tomas had been stopped. It was the kind of description that could describe half the county if you said it fast enough. But instead of admitting the description was weak, the deputies treated the weakness like a reason to hold Tomas longer. That's the trick. When the information is vague, enforcement fills the gaps with suspicion. Tomas didn't raise his voice, but he did tighten his boundaries. He explained clearly that he was being treated like a suspect without solid information. He said the stop felt like it was happening because he was a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said it in a way that didn't invite debate, more like a statement of reality. A nearby neighbor had fully locked in by then. People were watching from driveways and porches. At least one person was recording too. And Tomas's live stream meant none of this could be cleaned up later with a rewritten narrative. That's when Deputy Rourke, the one who seemed stuck between sides, kept trying to soften it. He kept insisting it wasn't about race. He kept trying to sell procedure. He kept trying to calm Thomas down even though Thomas was already calm. And that right there was the tell. When someone is already calm and you keep telling them to calm down, it's not about their behavior. It's about making them smaller. Tomas didn't take the bait. He didn't turn it into a yelling match. He kept it tight and factual. He pointed out that he had done everything asked of him. He had given ID. He had explained his presence. He had offered proof. He had stayed respectful. And still he was being surrounded like he was dangerous. The deputy responded with more reassurance, and Tomas responded by continuing to document. This part matters because it's where most situations like this go wrong. Not because the innocent person gets aggressive, but because officers get impatient. They start treating the person's dignity as defiance. They start using tone as justification. They start stacking little claims to build a reason to do more. But Tomas never gave them the emotional reaction they were used to controlling. And that forced the deputies to rely on the one thing they couldn't manipulate: actual identification from the witness. Eventually, word came through that they were getting a clearer image from someone who had seen the suspect more directly. A video still, a better look. Something concrete. And for the first time, the deputy's confidence shifted into hesitation. The body language changed. Less chest-forward energy, less "we got him." More side glances between deputies. More radio checking. More waiting for the final piece to save face. Then it came in. A clearer image reached them, and it didn't match Tomas. Not the face, not the build, not the clothes, not the person. The entire reason they were holding Tomas evaporated in a second. And you could see how fast the system flips when it realizes it's wrong. The deputies backed off the intensity almost immediately. The stance loosened. The tone softened. The talk became polite. The same people who had treated Tomas like a threat started treating him like a misunderstanding. Apologies followed. Not the kind that fully owned the harm, the kind that tried to smooth it over. They said they were just responding to a call. They said they had to check. They said it was an overreaction. They said sorry for the inconvenience. Tomas accepted the reality without absorbing the blame. He didn't celebrate. He didn't insult them. He didn't explode. He did something more effective. He made it plain that the problem wasn't one deputy's attitude. The problem was the entire process that allowed a vague description to turn into a multi-card detention of an innocent man. And he ended it with a line that stuck because it was simple and accurate. He said they hadn't stopped him because they knew. They stopped him because they guessed. That was the moment the deputies couldn't argue with, because the video proved it. They released him. Tomas kept walking away under his own control, phone still recording, still steady. He didn't run off like someone afraid. He left like someone who understood he had just survived a system that can decide your reality for you. But the story didn't end on that street. Because once the live stream and bystander recordings hit the internet, the stop stopped being an internal matter. It became public evidence. By the time Tomas got back to his route, the stop was already turning into something bigger than one bad call. Because Tomas hadn't just been detained. He had been detained on camera in a way that showed every step of the process. Vague description, aggressive posture, multiple units, long delay, and then the instant flip when the evidence finally showed they had the wrong person. That's why it spread. Clips from his live stream started circulating first. Then the bystander footage added a second angle that made it harder for anyone to claim the camera missed context. People could see Tomas's demeanor. They could see his hands. They could see that he wasn't acting like someone who had just committed a burglary. They could also see how many patrol cars were involved for what was supposed to be a quick verification. The comments weren't confused about what happened. A lot of people focused on the same pattern. The deputy kept insisting it wasn't a race thing. But the only reason Tomas became the center of a burglary response was because he was a black man who vaguely matched an inconsistent description. People pointed out the logic trap, how the system can treat someone as suspicious first and then look for justification later. In the days after, the department's response followed a predictable path. There was no big, direct ownership of harm. There was no immediate public apology that matched the seriousness of the stop. Instead, it was framed like a normal, reasonable action based on a call for service. The language leaned on protocol, public safety, and responding to reports. It was meant to sound neutral, but the video made neutral hard to sell. Because viewers had watched deputies hold an innocent man in place while admitting the stop was being pushed by a sergeant. That detail mattered. It suggested that the escalation wasn't just random decision-making in the moment. It was a supervisor-driven choice to lean into detention even when the match was weak. Tomas didn't treat the viral attention like entertainment. He treated it like leverage. He made it clear through what he posted and how he talked about it that the issue wasn't hurt feelings. It was how quickly a vague description can become a justification for a high-pressure stop, and how easily that pressure can turn into something worse if the person detained makes one wrong movement or says one wrong sentence. He also kept everything organized: timestamps, clips, the sequence of events. Who said what and when? When the deputies acknowledged the description was unclear. When they admitted the push was coming from a sergeant. When they received the clear image and immediately backed off. That's how accountability works when you're serious. You don't rely on outrage, you rely on proof. Meanwhile, the actual suspect didn't disappear into the air. The suspected burglary wasn't some mystery with no outcome. The person who was actually involved, described later as a man who stole a leaf blower in Deltona, was eventually identified, located, and arrested. And the contrast made the situation even sharper. Tomas got a multi-card detention for jogging, while the real suspect was found the normal way, through clearer identification and follow-up. That outcome didn't erase what happened to Tomas. It confirmed it, because it proved the stop had never been solid. It had been a guess fueled by urgency and a description that wasn't good enough to justify how aggressively they treated him. As the clip kept circulating, more people in the area started sharing similar stories. People described being stopped because they fit something that was never specific. People described being treated like a suspect first and a citizen second. Even people who supported policing said the same thing. If descriptions are that vague, the system needs guardrails because otherwise it becomes a dragnet. That public pressure is what forced the behind-the-scenes part. Complaints got filed. Records requests got made. Supervisors had to answer internal questions about why multiple units were used, why the detention lasted as long as it did, and why the explanation kept shifting until the clearer image arrived. And that's the part a lot of viewers don't realize. Departments can ignore one angry phone call, but they can't easily ignore organized documentation plus viral evidence plus a clean timeline. What happened next wasn't a movie ending where everyone gets fired on the spot. It was more realistic. There were reviews, there were meetings, there were supervisors asking what the deputies believed the description was. At the moment they decided Tomas couldn't leave. There were questions about how a burglary response became a public detention of a cooperative runner. If the department had any sense, they also used it as a training example because that's what it was. A real-life demonstration of how fit the description can become a shortcut to bias, even when nobody wants to say the word out loud. And Tomas walked away with something that mattered. Not just the fact that he was cleared, but the fact that he was believed, because the footage made it impossible to rewrite him into a threat. He didn't have to prove his innocence through emotions. He proved it through reality. Over time, the neighborhood took its own lesson too. People got more careful about what they reported. Some people started asking better questions before calling things in, and others started watching police encounters differently. Less like entertainment, more like a moment where someone's life can change because of a bad assumption. And Tomas kept running, not because he forgot what happened, but because he refused to let that stop claim his routine, his peace, or his right to exist in public without being treated like a suspect. Here's the lesson that sat underneath the whole thing. When the system runs on vague descriptions and adrenaline, the first person who fits becomes the target. And if there's no camera, no witness, no oversight, the story can end up written by the people with the badge instead of the people telling the truth. So let me ask you, if you were Tomas, what would you have done differently, if anything? And if you've ever been stopped for fitting a description, drop it in the comments. because people need to hear how common this really is. If you want more true-to-life story times about everyday racism, power, and real accountability, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.